Hello, my friends. This is Lynda Lippin, and welcome to the Pilates Goddess podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to yet another episode of the Pilates Goddess podcast. I, as always, want to thank all of you who are listening. And to all of you who email me, send me direct messages, leave me comments on social media, and sometimes sign up for my programs based on listening to this podcast. That makes me extremely happy. And I realize that today I'm already on episode 65, which seems a little insane, but here we are. I received 2 episode topic requests via direct message over the past few weeks, and one was to do an episode directly addressing tight hip flexors or perceived tight hip flexors, as the case often is, and an episode dedicated to sacroiliac instability and how to deal with that. And it's interesting because it is true that if you look at pretty much any Pilates teacher discussion online, I would say that at least 2 to 3 times a week in any given group, somebody brings up tight hip flexors or their clients with tight hip flexors and how do we stretch the hip flexors and people having pain in their hip flexors and sometimes pain only on one side, and how do you deal with that? And I have some strong opinions on this, but I also have a lot of science-based fact and opinion on this. So let's start with just a basic understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about hip flexion at all. So all we're doing when we talk about hip flexion is we're talking about basically hinging at the hip. So whether we are stabilizing the upper body and moving the leg into up towards the chest or the belly, or whether we are standing and then sitting the hips back into like footwork or a squat or a deadlift, or just sitting and standing, that's what we call hip flexion. Okay. It's that forward bend at the hip. Now, we have a number of muscles that assist with flexing at the hip. One of the main ones, and probably the deepest one, and the one that gets the most attention in many ways, is the psoas. Now, the psoas muscle is very, very interesting. If you eat meat and you've ever eaten a tenderloin of any form from any animal, because you can have pork tenderloins, you can have filet mignon or beef tenderloin, you have eaten an animal's psoas. And of course, in animals that are on all fours, the majority of the time, that psoas muscle is nice and soft. It still does the same thing that ours does, okay? It attaches the lumbar spine to the thigh, to the femur. But of course, if you're not weight bearing solely on your legs, which causes the psoas to have to run a little bit of a different pathway, that psoas stays pretty lean and pretty tender. And that's essentially what we're dealing with. So if you've ever, seen a whole like beef tenderloin, which can be pretty large, you may see them at Costco. You may see them at a butcher shop. You have a visual of what our psoas looks like because it looks relevantly similar. The difference is because we are bipeds and we stand up, The psoas actually has to pass through and around the pelvis. And it's that pass that can often make things a little funkier and fishier for us in terms of using that psoas and having that psoas working properly. But if you can still get an image in your head of just a long, lean muscle that attaches to your lowest rib, to T12, okay, to that vertebrae, and to each vertebrae underneath it, and then passes through along with the iliacus. That's why we call that whole complex the iliopsoas. Kind of merges with the iliacus as it comes inside of the pelvis, and then attaches to the femur. And it attaches to the femur at the inner part of the femur, not at the outside. So it really is pulling your lower back towards your legs and pulling your legs towards your lower back, i.e., hip flexion. Now we have other muscles in our legs and our pelvic areas that obviously assist with hip flexion, right? The quadricep muscles, all four of them, assist with hip flexion. And obviously, if you're a little tight and maybe not moving so well through the back of your leg and the side of your hip, you can have some issues there as well. Also note that especially in women, but also in men, you can have hernias in that area in the groin. I know that when I had endometriosis before my hysterectomies several decades ago, and also had a lot of pain on ovulation, I would get a lot of pain and tenderness on one side. That would sometimes radiate through the entire psoas and give me some lower back pain on one side, as well as pain inside of my hip. Right inside of the hip bone, which was psoas pain, but not coming from the muscle, coming from inflammation happening underneath. Now, the psoas ideally is balanced out by all of the other muscles around the pelvis. So that even though it wants to, pull your lower back towards your leg, you also have abdominal muscles, you have glutes, you have hamstrings, you have other muscles in there that will hold that lower back steady. Even though your psoas always, when it engages, is going to pull your thigh up towards your lower back, it again gets assistance from your quadriceps, from some of the adductors, and then stabilization from the other muscles in that area, as well as, of course, some eccentric contractions, some lengthening in the back of the leg. Now, human beings generally in this day and age sit a lot. We just do. And when you sit, you are obviously in hip flexion, okay? So folks who sit can get tight in the hip flexors as a result of simply being in that position for many of their waking hours in a day. But we also tend to associate tight with something that always needs to be stretched. We tend to associate tight with strong. And a lot of times in the case of tight hip flexors, they're actually pretty weak. And what happens is that just by virtue of sitting And by virtue of having the hamstrings get a little weak and overstretched from sitting, by virtue of having the glutes get a little weak and overstretched from sitting, as a result of the quadriceps and the muscles in the front of the thigh becoming tight at the top from sitting, but maybe a little overstretched by the knee, again from sitting, we can have a whole chunk of imbalance that happens in the lower body that we sometimes just blame wholeheartedly on tight hip flexors. So if you are a Pilates teacher or personal trainer or yoga teacher or handle people's bodies in any way, I have no doubt, because I did it, that you might look at somebody who, say, has a little bit of a over lumbar lordosis, right? That they're pulling a little too far forward. Or somebody who has problems doing extension exercises and can't really, say, lay on their stomach or come into single leg kick, propped up on their elbows and forearms and manage to bend their knee and kick towards their hip in hip extension without their hip crease completely lifting up off the ground. And we automatically say, oh, well, their hip flexors must be really, really tight. And oftentimes our first instinct is to stretch the tight hip flexors. But if you think about the fact that for most people, their hip flexors are tight and weak, not tight and strong, stretching them actually makes things worse in the long run, because then they just become overstretched and weak, which actually can lead to a lot more problems. So what you may be thinking, what would you like us to do, Lynda, with this whole conundrum of the psoas and the tight hip flexors? And here's what I'm going to tell you. The best thing that you can do for folks with tight and weak hip flexors, which frankly are going to be the majority of your clients coming into the Pilates studio, is give them good, balanced leg, pelvis, and back work. These are the folks who need to be doing footwork, and they need to be doing footwork focusing on the standing length as that carriage is pressed all the way back. Okay? These are folks who need to be doing, if you're working in a regular gym, these are folks who need to be doing squats. They need to be doing deadlifts. They need to be doing hip thrusts or bridging exercises. Okay? They need to be doing small extensions, small hyperextensions, and a lot of kind of hamstring and glute work, and especially work on what I like to affectionately call the side butt. Okay, you want to be working into the TFL and the glute medius. And this is going to come up in Thursday's episode also when I dig deep into sacroiliac instability, right? Because obviously any muscles that are around your pelvis and your sacrum are going to be involved in dealing with any instability there. But again, I'm going to repeat, you want to continue moving and strengthening through that entire area of the thighs, the lower back, the abdomen, the pelvis, i.e. the Pilates powerhouse. You want to do it in full ranges of motion. You want to do it starting in closed kinetic chain environments. So again, that's when we're looking at our squats, at our deadlifts, at our footwork, at our work on the chair, at leg springs, at, any work like that. And you want to work evenly through the front, the back, and the sides. Okay, so with the thighs, you're going to want to work some abduction and some standing work where you might be stabilizing on one leg. You want to work a little bit of adduction. You want to do some inner thigh and inner quad work. You also want to be doing hip flexion and extension, knee flexion and extension in both hip extension and hip flexion, because there's many ways that we can move that lower body. Okay, and you want to be doing a little bit of rotation and circumduction in those hips to maintain pelvic stability and make sure that the lower back is steady. Because sometimes we really want to stabilize and sometimes we really want to move. Okay, but you want to make sure, for example, that when your client is bringing their knee into their chest, that they're not moving their lower back while they do it. The cue that I actually use for folks who are starting with me online and they're starting to get into the position for the 100 or the position for the double leg lower lift is I will actually say to them, straighten your legs up. And if you can keep your spine where it is with a heavy sacrum and a long spine and your lower back's not pulling forward, it's not pushing anywhere, it's just nice and steady, start to lower your legs away from your body and feel when your back wants to pull forward. And as soon as you feel that want of your lower back to go with your legs forward, that's when you've really reached the limit of what your hip flexor is going to allow you to do. You're going to back off of that a little bit, and that's going to be your position until you get a little bit stronger. Yes, we can squeeze the heels together and engage a little bit more through the inside and the back of the thigh. Yes, we are also using our abdominals to pull in and up and help give that whole area some support. And yes, if you have good bone density and you can curl your ribs up towards your hips, you're going to be in an even more supported and better position. Like you may notice that maybe while you're listening to this, you'll try this, unless you're driving, in which case you won't, or walking around the city. But if you lie on your back and you come into classic position for the 100 so that your ribs are curled up, but you're just to the tips of your shoulder blades, your collarbones are open, knees into the chest and legs up to the ceiling, that in that position, you can really keep your lower back down without having to really posteriorly tilt your pelvis, right? You can just kind of hold the ribs and hips together, pull into the abdominal muscles and find that support. And from there, you can lower your legs down away from your body. But then what I would like you to do is lower your upper body down to the mat in the way you would need to if you were modifying for somebody with neck pain, if you were modifying for somebody with a shoulder injury, and if you're modifying for somebody with osteoporosis. And note that when your upper body is down, you cannot lower your legs quite as much because, again, you don't have that strong abdominal contraction that is now helping those hip flexors work and stabilize. So that's why when the upper body's down, it's sometimes the Pilates mat exercises and the other exercises are even harder than they are. Like we tend to think head down for the 100 or the ab series as a modification. But the fact of the matter is that it's a lot harder to hold your legs up and away from your body with your upper body down on the ground than it is if you've curled your upper body up, ribs towards hips. It's just a different way of doing the exercise. But again, the focus there is on the hip flexors. Now, if folks really do have super tight hip flexors, there are a few things you can do that are going to make their lives a little bit better. And it's going to make Pilates feel a little bit more doable for them. Okay. First is you're not going to talk to them about stretching their hip flexors. Okay. You're not going to do it. Second thing is you are not going to have them bring their legs into tabletop. Tabletop is a position that is extremely straining to the hip flexors. Your client will be much better off with their knees pulled in towards their torso a little bit more. It's actually more supported to have the knees in a little bit closer to the body. So it's super, super important that you make sure that your clients understand that what they don't want is to consistently have a feeling like their quadriceps are cramping and like their lower back wants to pull somewhere. Okay, that is not a way to live. And that is not something we necessarily want to do to them in the Pilates studio or, whether that's online or virtual. So let your clients come into a full range of motion with those hips and knees. Unless they have an injury or some reason why they have to shorten range of motion, let those knees come all the way in. Let those hips really flex and then really extend. Remember, part of the problem in sitting is that we don't flex more or extend more. We kind of stay in the same position. When we're exercising, we don't do that, right? We move through different ranges of motion. And that's really, really important. Now, if your client is having a lot of problems doing things like the roll up, which can be very, very hard with tight, weak hip flexors, what I recommend that you do is take one or two of the black sticky pads that we have all over the Pilates studio, or take a hand towel and fold it up into a rectangular shape, and you're going to put that under the lower back, under the lumbar curve. And what that's going to allow your client to be able to do, or you, is it's going to allow you to keep your sacrum very heavy and resist the urge to come into a very strong posterior pelvic tilt, which will flex your hips. And it will allow you to start to move through the spine while keeping your sacrum heavy. It's a game changer. It was a game changer for me, and it's a game changer for tons of my clients. In fact, I used to just tell new clients when they came in to take a mat class when I was still teaching at Parrot Key that they should just take an extra hand towel with them when they got their mat. And that way, if they were having problems doing the roll up or doing neck pull or doing any of those exercises, they could work with that towel under their lower back. And frankly, I still hear from some of these folks, and it's been over a decade, who still do that because they had always struggled and now they don't. So, depending on your posture, depending on what else you got going on in your body, it's really okay to use modifications like this forever. It's not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign that anything is wrong with you. It's just a sign that you have a certain posture type or a certain way of moving your body, or maybe your legs are longer than your torso or your torso is longer than your legs. And, you need some support to help out with that differential when you're doing open kinetic chain mat work. I also recommend that you do a lot of bridging And it doesn't have to be articulated bridging. It can be hip hinge bridging. I like to teach bridging in many different foot positions. I do actually the positions of footwork. I do heels together, toes apart. I do feet and knees together. I do feet and knees hip width apart. I add knee lifts. I add straight leg kicks. I add all the things that we might add in Pilates to those bridges. But bridges are great because, especially with the knee lifts, you're working hip extension and hip flexion at the same time. It's awesome. And again, really, really good for balancing out the strength and flexibility in the lower body. And then finally, I really recommend that you do a lot of side lying work, but not clams. And you may wonder why I say that. Now, if you want to just get good strength and length and mobility for your clients, if you work them on their side and really do the classical series of front and back kicks, of bicycles, of kicks up to the ceiling and down, of small circles, of hot potatoes, of all of those things, your clients are going to get good hip flexion, good hip extension, good work into the abductors at the side of the hip. And of course, there's also the whole inner thigh series, which is going to be great for all of your clients. And frankly, you can play with the position of that top leg. Everybody who takes my classes online knows, or has taken them live, knows that I am not a stickler for having that top knee bent and in a certain position. For folks who are comfortable there, that's perfectly fine. I have some clients with arthritis, and they actually bring the top leg slightly behind the bottom leg and then bring the bottom leg a little more forward to do the inner thigh lifts and do that work. I sometimes have clients after they've done all of the series on the top leg and that's really tired and sore. They just bend that top knee and rest it down on the mat and get a little bit of stretch through the glutes and through the side muscles there. So there's, plenty of ways to kind of get that work done. And then when you're bringing people into any extension and any hyperextension, just be mindful that they have their pelvis and hip crease solidly on the mat. So they're heavy in their hip bones, their pubic bones, and in the front of each thigh and through the crease before they move. For a lot of folks, small ranges of motion in this are going to be much better for them at the beginning than large. And really, if you look at the whole side kick series, if you took that series and did it standing, you would realize that you're doing a lot of the work and movement that the legs do in gait, right? We're swinging the leg forward and backward. We're going through kicking forward and bending and swinging backward, kicking backward, bending, swinging forward. All of these things help us to walk, help us to sit and stand, and help get good movement back into that lower body and that lumbar spine. So once again, if you think that you or your clients have tight hip flexors, they probably do, but I don't want you to worry about it. I just want you to work those clients through full range of motion exercises and allow them to get stronger. Stop with the tabletop. Stop with the small ranges of motion all the time. Let your clients move. Let them get stronger. And I promise you that they will start to balance out and they will start to feel and function a little bit better. And please, please stop telling them that they have tight hip flexors or tight this or tight that. Just let them move. Let them do the exercises. Exercise is supposed to be hard, right? Because it makes everything else easy. Okay, so stop prescribing, stop diagnosing, and let's just get people moving on the mat and equipment, doing full body functional exercises that we do in Pilates that will help balance out their strength and flexibility. Because ultimately, what a lot of these clients need is not necessarily looser hip flexors, but what they need are stronger hip flexors that will allow for more contraction, both eccentrically and concentrically. Okay. And that's why it's good to work them in as full of a range of motion as you can in terms of hip flexion and extension. All right. You guys have any questions? You have any concerns? You have any opinions on this one? Get in touch with me. You can email me at Lynda@lyndalippin.com. You can also DM me on all of the social medias or leave a comment on one of my posts, and I will get back to you with some answers, or I'll use your comment and or question as a basis for another podcast episode. So once again, guys, thank you so much for listening. Thank you to everybody who has rated and reviewed the podcast. If you haven't yet, I would really appreciate it if you would go to the Apple Podcasts app or Spotify or Podchaser, and the links are in the show notes, and leave a rating and review. And please subscribe. It all helps. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the Pilates Goddess podcast. Music brought to you by Nerd Salad. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, especially if you liked it. And please like, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks.